On January 7, 2026, a fatal shooting involving a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) officer occurred in South Minneapolis, resulting in the death of 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good. Good was a U.S. citizen and longtime Minneapolis resident. The shooting took place during a federal immigration enforcement operation that had deployed additional ICE agents to the region. According to authorities, federal agents approached a vehicle in which Good was seated. During the encounter, an ICE officer discharged a firearm, striking Good. She later died from her injuries. The incident immediately drew national attention due to conflicting accounts from federal officials, local authorities, and video footage recorded by bystanders. The killing also reignited debates around the use of force by federal law enforcement agencies and the scope of ICE operations within U.S. cities. The case remains under federal investigation, and no final legal conclusions have yet been announced. The shooting occurred near the intersection of East 33rd Street and Portland Avenue in a residential neighborhood of South Minneapolis. This area is characterized by single-family homes and small apartment buildings, making the presence of heavily armed federal agents particularly noticeable to residents. Witnesses reported seeing multiple unmarked vehicles and officers wearing tactical gear in the vicinity that morning. The neighborhood was not previously informed of the operation. Following the shooting, the area was cordoned off by law enforcement, and traffic was restricted for several hours. Local residents described confusion and fear as emergency responders arrived. Minneapolis city officials later stated that they were not given advance notice of the specific enforcement action that led to the shooting. The setting contributed to public concern about the conduct of federal operations in civilian neighborhoods and the risks posed to bystanders. Sequence of events captured on video footage from bystanders and officer body cameras has played a central role in public understanding of the incident. The recordings show ICE agents approaching a Honda Pilot SUV stopped on the street. One agent attempts to open the driver's side door while others position themselves around the vehicle. Moments later, the SUV begins to move forward. An ICE officer then fires multiple shots into the vehicle. The footage does not clearly show the SUV striking the officer before shots were fired, a point that has become central to disputes over the justification for lethal force. The vehicle continued moving after the shots and eventually collided with parked cars. The videos have been reviewed by media outlets, civil rights groups, and investigators, and they have raised questions about whether the officer faced an immediate threat at the time of the shooting. Immediate aftermath and medical response after the shots were fired, emergency medical personnel were dispatched to the scene. Renee Nicole Good was found inside the vehicle with gunshot wounds and was transported to a nearby hospital. Despite medical intervention, she was pronounced dead later that day. Law enforcement secured the scene for evidence collection, including shell casings, video recordings, and witness statements. ICE confirmed that no officers were hospitalized as a result of the incident. The SUV sustained visible damage from both gunfire and subsequent collisions with parked vehicles. News of Good's death spread quickly through local and national media, prompting immediate responses from elected officials and advocacy organizations. Vigils were organized within hours, reflecting the intensity of public reaction. The handling of the scene and the rapid federal response became part of the broader scrutiny surrounding the case. Federal government's initial statement, the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees ICE, released an early statement asserting that the officer acted in self-defense. Officials claimed that Good attempted to use her vehicle as a weapon, placing the officer in imminent danger. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and President Donald Trump publicly echoed this characterization. Some federal officials went further, labeling the act as a form of domestic terrorism, a description that immediately drew criticism. These statements were issued before the release of full video footage and before independent investigations were completed. Critics argued that the language used by federal leaders appeared to prejudge the outcome of the investigation. The framing of the incident by DHS became a focal point of controversy, particularly as additional evidence emerged that challenged aspects of the official narrative. Challenges to the official narrative. Local officials and independent analysts raised concerns after reviewing available video footage. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey stated publicly that the videos did not clearly support claims that the vehicle was driven directly at the officer. Civil rights attorneys and use-of-force experts also questioned whether lethal force met established legal standards. Several media outlets conducted frame-by-frame analyses of the footage, noting the brief timeframe between the vehicle's movement and the shots fired. These assessments suggested that the threat level may not have been as clear as federal officials initially claimed. The divergence between federal statements and visual evidence intensified calls for an independent investigation. The dispute highlighted long-standing tensions between federal law enforcement agencies and local governments regarding accountability and transparency. Investigation and jurisdiction. The Federal Bureau of Investigation assumed primary responsibility for investigating the shooting, while the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension initially responded. State authorities later confirmed that the case was being handled federally due to the office's status. This jurisdictional shift limited the role of local prosecutors. Minneapolis officials expressed frustration over restricted access to evidence. The FBI stated that it would conduct a thorough review, including forensic analysis and interviews with witnesses and officers involved. As of the latest reports, no charges have been filed, and the investigation remains ongoing. Civil rights groups have urged the appointment of a special prosecutor to ensure impartiality. The investigative process is expected to take months, with findings subject to review by the Department of Justice. Identification of the ICE officer. Media outlets later identified the ICE officer involved as Jonathan Ross, a veteran law enforcement agent with years of service. Federal agencies typically avoid publicly naming officers during active investigations, but Ross's identity emerged through reporting. ICE has not released his full service record but confirmed that he was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, consistent with standard procedure. Supporters of law enforcement emphasized the dangers officers face during enforcement operations. Critics argued that transparency regarding the officer's background was essential for public trust. The naming of the officer further intensified national attention and debate, particularly as advocacy groups began examining patterns in previous ICE use of force incidents across the country. Community reaction in Minneapolis. The killing of Renee Nicole sparked immediate protests across Minneapolis. Demonstrators gathered near the shooting site and outside government buildings, demanding accountability and justice. Community leaders described the incident as deeply traumatic, particularly given Minneapolis's history with police-involved shootings. Chants and signs called for the defunding or abolition of ICE. Vigils honored Good's life and focused on her role as a mother and writer. Local organizations coordinated legal observers and mental health support for residents affected by the incident. The protests remained largely peaceful but underscored the depth of public anger and mistrust toward federal law enforcement operations in the city. National protests and solidarity actions beyond Minneapolis. Protests erupted in cities including Washington, D.C., New York, Boston, and Portland. Demonstrators linked Good's death to broader concerns about immigration enforcement and federal policing tactics. Advocacy groups organized marches, sit-ins, and public forums. Several members of Congress referenced the shooting during floor speeches, calling for oversight hearings. The national response reflected a convergence of immigration rights activism and police accountability movements. Social media amplified video footage and eyewitness accounts, further fueling public engagement. The widespread demonstrations signaled that the incident resonated far beyond Minnesota, becoming a symbol in ongoing debates over federal authority and civil liberties. Political and legal debate. The shooting quickly became a point of political contention. Democratic lawmakers criticized the federal government's handling of the case, while some Republican officials defended the officer's actions as necessary. Legal scholars debated whether the use of deadly force met constitutional standards. The incident also renewed calls for reforming ICE's operational protocols, particularly in urban environments. Congressional committees requested briefings from DHS, though no formal hearings have yet concluded. The polarized response reflected broader national divisions over immigration policy and law enforcement accountability. As investigations continue, political leaders remain under pressure to address public demands for transparency and reform. Civil rights and human rights concerns. Human rights organizations, including domestic and international groups, condemned the shooting and questioned whether it constituted an unjustified killing. Reports emphasized that Good was not the target of an immigration arrest and was a U.S. citizen. Advocates argued that the incident demonstrated the risks of aggressive enforcement tactics. Calls were made for clearer rules governing when ICE officers may use lethal force. Some organizations submitted formal complaints to the Department of Justice, urging civil rights investigations. These concerns added legal and moral dimensions to the case, extending scrutiny beyond the immediate facts of the shooting. Family statements and personal background. Good's family released statements describing her as compassionate, creative, and deeply committed to her children. They emphasized her work as a poet and writer and expressed profound grief. Family members disputed federal claims that she posed a threat and called for justice. Friends and colleagues shared memories highlighting her kindness and community involvement. Fundraisers were organized to support her children and cover legal expenses. These personal accounts humanized the case and countered narratives that focused solely on the confrontation. The family has stated their intention to pursue all available legal avenues. Broader context of ICE operations: the shooting occurred amid an expansion of federal immigration enforcement efforts. ICE had increased operations in several U.S. cities, prompting concern from local governments. Minneapolis officials reiterated their opposition to aggressive federal actions without local coordination. The incident intensified scrutiny of how ICE conducts operations in communities not traditionally associated with immigration enforcement. Analysts noted that such operations can blur lines between immigration enforcement and general policing. The broader context underscored systemic questions about federal power, community safety, and civil rights. Ongoing impact and unresolved questions as investigations continue. The fatal shooting of Renee Nicole remains unresolved. Key questions persist regarding the justification for lethal force, the accuracy of federal statements, and the adequacy of oversight mechanisms. The case has already influenced public discourse, protests, and policy discussions. Its outcome may have lasting implications for ICE practices and federal accountability. For now, the incident stands as a reminder of the high stakes involved in law enforcement operations and the importance of transparency. The final conclusions of investigators will shape public trust and potentially set precedents for future cases. National and international media outlets devoted extensive coverage to the shooting, often highlighting the contrast between official federal statements and the available video evidence. Headlines emphasized the unanswered questions surrounding the use of force and the speed with which conclusions were initially drawn by federal authorities. Some outlets focused on the broader implications for immigration enforcement, while others centered on Good's personal story and community impact. Media analysts noted how early framing can shape public perception long before investigations are completed. The case became a frequent topic on cable news panels, podcasts, and opinion columns, reflecting its resonance across ideological lines. The ongoing release of footage and statements ensured that public attention did not quickly fade. Video recordings played a decisive role in shaping public discourse around the incident. Bystander footage and body camera recordings provided visual documentation that allowed independent analysis beyond official summaries. Civil rights advocates emphasized that without video evidence, the federal narrative might have gone largely unchallenged. Legal experts noted that video has increasingly become central in modern accountability debates, though it does not always provide definitive answers. In this case, the ambiguity within the footage intensified disagreement rather than resolving it. The reliance on video underscored broader societal questions about transparency, interpretation, and trust in law enforcement narratives. City leaders in Minneapolis reiterated long-standing concerns about federal agencies conducting operations without coordination with local governments. Officials emphasized that such actions complicate community safety efforts and strain public trust. The shooting deepened existing tensions between city leadership and federal authorities, particularly around jurisdiction and accountability. Minneapolis leaders called for greater clarity regarding federal enforcement protocols within city limits. These disputes reflected broader national friction between sanctuary-oriented cities and federal immigration enforcement agencies. Use of force experts pointed to Supreme Court precedents governing when law enforcement may deploy deadly force. Central to these standards is whether an officer faces an immediate threat of serious bodily harm. Analysts noted that determining such threat perceptions often depends on split-second judgments but must still meet objective legal thresholds. In the Good case, debate focused on whether the movement of the vehicle met that standard. These legal discussions underscored the difficulty of adjudicating fatal encounters where evidence is incomplete or contested. ICE confirmed that the officer involved was placed on administrative leave, a routine step following officer-involved shootings. Internal reviews were initiated alongside the federal investigation. Critics argued that internal agency reviews often lack independence, while supporters said they are necessary for procedural accountability. The internal process, though largely opaque to the public, became another focal point for calls demanding transparency and external oversight. Several members of Congress publicly called for briefings from the Department of Homeland Security regarding the incident. Some lawmakers requested documentation related to ICE operational planning, use of force training, and deployment decisions. While no immediate legislative action followed, the case entered broader congressional discussions about immigration enforcement reform. Oversight advocates stressed that federal agencies wield significant power and must be subject to meaningful review when lethal force is used. Several members of Congress publicly called for briefings from the Department of Homeland Security regarding the incident. Some lawmakers requested documentation related to ICE operational planning, use of force training, and deployment decisions. While no immediate legislative action followed, the case entered broader congressional discussions about immigration enforcement reform. Oversight advocates stressed that federal agencies wield significant power and must be subject to meaningful review when lethal force is used. Legal experts indicated that the family of Renee Nicole could pursue civil litigation, regardless of the outcome of criminal investigations. Such cases often focus on wrongful death claims and constitutional violations. Civil suits can take years to resolve and may uncover additional evidence through discovery processes. The possibility of litigation added another layer of legal scrutiny to the case and increased pressure on federal agencies to preserve evidence and documentation. Advocacy groups compared the shooting to previous federal law enforcement incidents involving disputed uses of deadly force. These comparisons were used to argue for systemic reforms rather than case-by-case responses. Analysts noted recurring themes, including rapid escalation, limited transparency, and delayed accountability. The good case was increasingly framed as part of a broader pattern rather than an isolated event. Public trust in federal institutions became a central issue following the shooting. Surveys and commentary suggested skepticism toward official statements issued before investigations concluded. Trust, experts noted, is difficult to restore once damaged. The case highlighted the importance of restraint, accuracy, and transparency in official communications following fatal incidents. As weeks passed without formal conclusions, frustration grew among activists, residents, and the victim's family. The slow pace of investigations, while common, intensified perceptions of injustice. Supporters of the process cautioned that thorough investigations require time. The waiting period itself became part of the public debate, symbolizing broader concerns about accountability delays. The shooting prompted renewed examination of ICE training, rules of engagement, and deployment strategies. Policy analysts questioned whether immigration enforcement operations should involve tactics resembling high-risk criminal raids. Discussions emerged around redefining ICE's role and limiting scenarios in which lethal force is likely. Vigils, murals, and community gatherings kept Renee Good's memory alive. These acts of remembrance served both as mourning and protest. Community members emphasized that remembering her as a person, not just a case, was essential. Memorialization became a way to resist depersonalization and preserve dignity. The outcome of the investigation may influence future federal policies, court rulings, and enforcement guidelines. Regardless of legal conclusions, the case has already shaped public expectations around transparency and restraint. Policymakers acknowledged that public scrutiny would remain intense for similar incidents in the future. The fatal shooting of Renee Nicole Good stands at the intersection of law enforcement authority, civil rights, and human consequence. While investigations continue, the facts established so far reveal a deeply contested encounter with lasting impact. The final determinations will shape accountability, policy, and public trust. Until then, the case remains a powerful reminder that behind every official statement and legal debate is a human life lost and a community seeking truth.